The Galactic Military Intelligence Consortium had seen many things in its 3,000-year history of cataloging the combat capabilities of various species. They had witnessed the crystalline Vorthok shatter mountains with harmonic frequencies, observed the gaseous nebulites phase through solid matter during combat, and documented the infamous incident where the insectoid hive minds had literally eaten their way through an enemy fleet's hulls. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for the sheer audacity of human battlefield reports. The tribunal chamber hummed with the soft bioluminescence of the Aquarian delegates, their tentacles swaying in what passed for skeptical murmurs among their kind. Across the curved amphitheater, the reptilian Sarok delegation clicked their claws against crystalline data tablets, a sound that roughly translated to "this is ridiculous" in 17 different languages. Even the usually stoic ethereal collective beings who communicated through pure thought and considered themselves above such mundane concerns as physical combat, had materialized enough corporeal form to express what could generously be called cosmic eye-rolling. At the center of this intergalactic circus of skepticism sat a single human, looking remarkably unimpressed by the assembled might of the galaxy's most advanced civilization. She wore the standard-issue combat fatigues of the Terran Defense Force, complete with enough medals to fund a small moon colony, and scars that spoke of experiences the assembled aliens couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. The Aquarian Tribunal leader, whose name roughly translated to "he who swims in bureaucratic waters," extended a primary tentacle toward a holographic display. "The defendant claims," he began, his voice carrying the wet, burbling quality that made universal translators work overtime, "that human soldiers can accurately engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters using primitive kinetic weapons." A chorus of what sounded suspiciously like alien laughter rippled through the chamber. The Sarok defense minister, a creature whose ancestors had been perfecting long-range plasma artillery when humans were still figuring out fire, clicked his claws dismissively. "Our analysis indicates that human ocular capabilities are insufficient for such precision. This is clearly an exaggeration designed to inflate their species' military value." The human veteran leaned back in her chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had survived 3 separate extinction-level events and a particularly nasty case of interdimensional flu. 2,000 meters is considered close-quarters combat in most of our training manuals, she said, her tone carrying the patience of a kindergarten teacher explaining why eating paste isn't a food group. This statement triggered what could only be described as an intergalactic collective seizure. The Vorthok delegate began resonating at frequencies that made nearby equipment spontaneously harmonize, while several nebulites accidentally phased halfway through their chairs in surprise. "Furthermore," continued the prosecutor, a being from the collective whose thought-speech carried undertones of intellectual superiority, "the defendant claims that human infantry can march for days without rest, carrying equipment loads that exceed their own body weight, while maintaining combat effectiveness." The assembled tribunal exchanged what passed for meaningful glances among species that had evolved from everything from deep-sea mollusks to sentient gas clouds. The Aquarian leader consulted his bioluminescent notes, which pulsed with the urgency of someone trying to maintain professional dignity while discussing the obviously impossible. "Our physiological assessments," intoned the Sarok representative, "indicate that such endurance would result in immediate metabolic collapse. No bipedal species can sustain such performance parameters without advanced cybernetic enhancement." The human's response was to pull out a standard-issue energy bar, the kind that military nutritionists had engineered to taste exactly like disappointment, but provide enough calories to fuel a small reactor. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and shrugged. "This is what we call a light snack. Most of our supply drops assume troops will be carrying 72 hours of equipment while covering approximately 50 kilometers per day. That's considered standard operational tempo for non-combat movement." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet typically reserved for the moments before solar systems collapsed into black holes or when someone mentioned politics at a diplomatic dinner party. The ethereal prosecutor pressed on, perhaps sensing that continuing this charade was preferable to acknowledging the growing possibility that their fundamental understanding of biology might be flawed. "The defendant also claims that human soldiers can function effectively after sustaining injuries that would incapacitate most known species. She specifically mentions combatants continuing to fight with what she terms flesh wounds that our medical analysis indicates would be immediately fatal to 97% of known sentient life." At this point, The human veteran began to look genuinely amused, which was considerably more terrifying than anything the aliens had encountered in their previous military assessment. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a patchwork of scar tissue that looked like it had been designed by an artist with a particularly dark sense of humor and access to high-grade explosives. "This one," she said, pointing to a particularly impressive specimen that wrapped around her forearm like a twisted bracelet, "was from when I had to perform field surgery on myself while under fire. Took about 6 minutes. The real challenge was keeping the plasma burns from going septic before I could reach medical support." The tribunal chamber fell so quiet that the ambient hum of life support systems sounded like a thrash metal concert. "Based on these clearly fabricated accounts," announced the Aquarian leader, his tentacles now glowing with the satisfied phosphorescence of a bureaucrat about to close an annoying case. "This tribunal finds that human military capabilities have been grossly exaggerated for the purposes of securing favorable defensive contracts. All human battlefield reports will be classified as narrative fiction and excluded from strategic planning database." The human veteran stood, straightened her uniform with the deliberate care of someone who had just watched a room full of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations collectively fail an intelligence test, and saluted with precision that would have made drill sergeants weep tears of pride. "Noted for the record," she said, and walked out of the chamber with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly how spectacularly wrong everyone was about to be. 3 standard galactic months later, the combined fleet of enlightened species hung in space like a constellation of technological superiority, their ships gleaming with the confidence that comes from possessing overwhelming firepower and absolutely certain intelligence report. The armada stretched across several light minutes, a testament to the galaxy's commitment to what they diplomatically termed humanitarian intervention, and what cynical observers might call a really expensive way to prove a point. Admiral Vex Prime of the Collective stood, or rather manifested on the bridge of the flagship, his ethereal form crackling with the satisfaction of a being who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved through superior technology and condescending lecture. Around him, the bridge buzzed with the efficient activity of dozens of species working in perfect harmony, which was impressive considering that half of them breathed methane and the other half considered methane a recreational drug. "Final intelligence briefing," announced the ship's AI, whose voice had been programmed to sound reassuringly competent rather than ominously omniscient, though the distinction was largely academic at this point. "Target species, Homo sapiens. Classification, primitive bipedal mammal. Technological level, embarrassingly quaint. Military capabilities grossly overestimated by their own propaganda." Commander Thak-9, whose species had evolved from something that looked like an angry pineapple crossed with a military academy, flexed his spinal ridges in what passed for confident agreement. "Our projections indicate complete planetary pacification within 72 standard hours. Resistance factors have been calculated using verified data sources, excluding all obvious fictional accounts." The irony was so thick it could have been bottled and sold as a condiment. Sub-Admiral Drift Pattern, a nebulite whose gaseous form occasionally coalesced into shapes resembling tactical diagrams, pulsed with the equivalent of enthusiastic nodding. "Human psychological profiles indicate they will surrender immediately when faced with superior technology. Their primitive tribal structure cannot withstand organized resistance for extended periods." Admiral Vex Prime examined the holographic display, showing Earth in all its blue and green glory, looking remarkably peaceful for a planet about to experience what the fleet's promotional materials euphemistically called aggressive diplomatic outreach. The planet rotated slowly, showing continents dotted with cities that, according to their intelligence, housed a species barely capable of coherent military organization. "Remind me again," the Admiral said, his thought speech carrying undertones of barely contained excitement, "why the consortium considers this species worth incorporating into our enlightened galactic community." "Strategic mineral deposits," replied the tactical officer, a Sarok whose scales had been polished to military regulation brightness. "Plus their planet sits at a useful hyperspace junction. The fact that they're occupying it is really more of a minor clerical error that we're here to correct." The fleet had spent months preparing for this moment, analyzing every scrap of data that hadn't been contaminated by what their xenobiologists had termed human narrative embellishment syndrome, a condition apparently endemic to the species and characterized by chronic inability to report military events without adding ridiculous fictional elements. First wave deployment is ready, reported the operations coordinator, a being whose species name translated roughly to those who count things very precisely. 15,000 assault craft, armed with non-lethal suppression systems. Standard occupation protocol assumes minimal resistance from a species whose documented military capabilities are, and I quote from the official assessment, largely imaginary. What followed was the kind of military briefing that would later be studied in warfare academies across the galaxy as a masterpiece of catastrophic overconfidence. Charts and graphs filled the air, showing projected casualty rates so low, they barely registered on the statistical display. Enemy response matrices indicated surrender probabilities hovering around 97%, with the remaining 3% attributed to what analysts had clinically termed confused running in circles. Intelligence confirms, continued the briefing officer, that human military doctrine relies primarily on large, slow-moving formations using primitive kinetic weapons with limited range and accuracy. Their supply chains are fragile, their command structure is chaotic, and their psychological resilience is negligible. Admiral Vex Prime's ethereal form shimmered with satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the carefully calculated projections that had excluded every single piece of evidence, suggesting this might not be the galactic equivalent of a pleasant afternoon picnic. Commence Phase 1, he commanded, his thought speech resonating through the bridge with the authority of someone about to learn some very expensive lessons about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. The first wave of assault craft descended toward Earth like a swarm of metallic locusts, their hulls gleaming with the confidence that comes from possessing overwhelming technological superiority and intelligence reports that wouldn't survive contact with reality for longer than it takes light to travel from a muzzle flash to a target. Down on Earth, early warning systems began registering what military computers initially classified as unusual atmospheric phenomena, then quickly reclassified as definitely not atmospheric phenomena, and finally settled on, but in the depths of military bunkers and command centers across the planet, a curious thing was happening. Officers were pulling out archived files, dusting off reports that had been dismissed as exaggerated fiction, and discovering that their supposedly unreliable intelligence had suddenly become very relevant indeed. The same reports that had been laughed out of galactic tribunals were now being distributed with the kind of urgency typically reserved for imminent catastrophe, or really good takeout delivery. And somewhere in the depths of military command, a certain combat veteran was probably permitting herself a small knowing smile. The first indication that the galaxy's most advanced military minds had perhaps miscalculated came approximately 14 minutes into the invasion, when Assault Wing Alpha 7 reported what their commander described as statistically impossible kinetic impacts at ranges that supposedly exceeded human visual capability by several orders of magnitude. "Command, this is Wing Leader Zek Tao," crackled the communication, accompanied by the distinctive sound of someone trying to maintain professional composure, while his worldview collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "We're taking accurate fire from ground positions." "Wait, this can't be right." 2,800 meters. Admiral Vex Prime's ethereal form flickered with what could generously be called confusion, and more accurately described as the beginning stages of cosmic panic. "Confirm that reading, Wing Leader. Our intelligence indicates human weapons are ineffective beyond 300 meters maximum range." "Sir, I'm reading multiple impact signatures on our hulls. Kinetic penetrators. They're actually punching through our deflector screens. With bullets, actual metal projectiles fired from tubes." The bridge fell silent, except for the gentle hum of life support systems working overtime to maintain atmosphere for beings who were rapidly questioning everything they thought they knew about physics, biology, and the general reliability of intelligence reports. Commander Thak-9's spinal ridges were now rigid with what his species traditionally reserved for encounters with natural disasters or particularly aggressive tax auditors. "Perhaps there's some sort of technological enhancement we missed, targeting computers, cybernetic implant." The response came not from Wing Leader Zek Tao, but from his sensor operator, whose voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had just watched impossible things happen with disturbing regularity. "Sir, we're detecting minimal electronic signatures from the ground position. These appear to be organic targeting solutions." Translation: humans were hitting targets at impossible ranges using nothing more sophisticated than eyeballs, basic trigonometry, and what appeared to be weaponized stubbornness. But the real education was just beginning. Wing Alpha 12 reporting came another transmission, this one carrying distinctly strained undertones. "Ground forces they're not retreating, sir. Repeat, human forces are not retreating in the face of superior firepower. They're advanced." Sub-Admiral Drift Pattern's gaseous form contracted into what could only be described as a very nervous cloud. "Advancing? Our psychological profiles clearly indicate immediate surrender when faced with overwhelming force. Sir, they're carrying equipment loads that our computers calculate should result in immediate structural failure of their skeletal systems. Current readings show individual soldiers bearing approximately 90 kilograms of equipment, while maintaining combat effectiveness across varied terrain." Admiral Vex Prime consulted his tactical displays with the growing certainty that someone, somewhere, had made a very significant error in judgment. The holographic battlefield showed red dots, representing human forces, moving in patterns that violated everything the galaxy's military academies taught about rational tactical behavior. "Assault Group Beta 4, report status," he commanded, his thought speech now carrying undertones of what his species experienced as approaching existential dread. "Sir, we engaged a human defensive position that intelligence reported as lightly fortified. The position has been under continuous bombardment for 6 hours. It should have been neutralized within minutes. And the humans are still shooting back, sir, with increasing accuracy." The next few hours provided what military historians would later describe as a comprehensive real-time education in the fundamental differences between theoretical combat assessment and practical application of Murphy's Law. Reports flooded in with the consistency of a particularly well-organized apocalypse. Human soldiers were performing battlefield surgery on themselves and returning to combat within time frames that violated basic biological principles. Infantry units were operating for days without resupply, apparently sustaining themselves on what their field reports described as spite and energy bars that taste like punishment. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports of human combat effectiveness under conditions that should have resulted in immediate incapacitation. Soldiers continued fighting with injuries that the galaxy's medical computers classified as immediately fatal, yet somehow failed to inform the humans involved. "Command, this is Recon Unit Gamma 9, reported a scout pilot whose voice had acquired the shell-shocked quality of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. "I'm observing a human medic performing field surgery while under fire. She's removing shrapnel from her own leg while treating other casualties. Confirm that report." "Sir, she just finished the surgery, picked up her weapon and returned to combat. Our medical analysis indicates she should be unconscious from blood loss." Admiral Vex Prime's form was now flickering with the erratic patterns that indicated severe computational stress among his species. Around the bridge, officers from a dozen different civilizations were experiencing the collective realization that their understanding of human military capabilities had been not merely wrong, but spectacularly, catastrophically inverted. The tactical displays now showed a battlefield that resembled less a military operation and more a comprehensive demonstration of everything the galaxy's finest military minds had gotten wrong about a species they'd dismissed as primitive storytellers. "Sir," came the final report that broke what remained of their confidence. "Human forces they're singing." "Singing? Yes, sir. While engaging superior numbers of our forces, combat effectiveness appears to be increasing proportionally with volume of vocal performance." And somewhere in a bunker deep beneath Earth's surface, military analysts were cross-referencing incoming battle reports with archived files that had once been dismissed as fiction, finding perfect matches with disturbing regularity. 6 months later, the Galactic Military Intelligence Consortium reconvened in the same chamber where they had so confidently dismissed human military capabilities as narrative fiction. The atmosphere had changed considerably. Instead of the smug certainty that had characterized their previous gathering, The assembled delegates now carried themselves with the subdued dignity of beings who had recently discovered that the universe possessed a rather twisted sense of humor. The same human veteran sat in the center of the chamber, though this time she wasn't wearing combat fatigues. Instead, she sported the crisp dress uniform of someone who had recently been promoted several times in rapid succession and given enough medals to start her own small gravitational field. Her expression suggested someone trying very hard not to say "I told you so," while simultaneously radiating the unmistakable aura of someone who absolutely definitively had told them so. The Aquarian tribunal leader, whose tentacles now pulsed with the subdued bioluminescence of profound embarrassment, cleared his breathing passages with the wet, uncomfortable sound of a being about to eat a considerable quantity of crow. The consortium wishes to revisit certain intelligence assessments made during our previous session. Around the chamber, various alien dignitaries shifted in ways that suggested discomfort was a universal constant, transcending species barriers with the efficiency of bad news or really effective advertising. The Saruk defense minister's claws clicked against his data tablet in patterns that roughly translated to "please let this end quickly" in 43 languages. Our Reese-field observations, continued the Aquarian with the careful tone of someone navigating a conversational minefield while blindfolded, suggest that human military capabilities may have been somewhat underestimated in our previous analysis. The human veteran's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested that somewhat underestimated ranked somewhere between mildly inaccurate and spectacularly wrong on the scale of diplomatic understatement. "The invasion fleet," announced the ethereal prosecutor, his thought speech now carrying undertones of what could only be described as cosmic humility, encountered certain discrepancies between predicted human response patterns and observed battlefield behavior. This was, of course, the kind of diplomatic language that made complete and utter catastrophic failure sound like a minor clerical error. The actual statistics told a somewhat more dramatic story. The most technologically advanced military force in galactic history had been systematically dismantled by a species that apparently considered impossible feats of endurance and accuracy to be standard operating procedure. Commander Thak-9 consulted his reports with the careful attention of someone reading his own obituary. Human forces demonstrated sustained combat effectiveness under conditions that our medical analysis indicated should result in immediate incapacitation. Furthermore, their tactical responses consistently exceeded all projected parameters for accuracy, endurance, and psychological resilience. The veteran finally spoke, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something very obvious to people who had worked very hard to miss the point. "We tried to tell you, every single capability you dismissed as narrative embellishment is documented in our standard training manuals. What you considered impossible is what we call Tuesday. Sub-admiral drift patterns, gaseous form condensed into shapes that vaguely resembled apology." Our analysis teams have reviewed the original testimony provided during the previous tribunal. Upon closer examination, we find that human military accounts were not, as previously assessed, exaggerated for propaganda purposes. "No," agreed the veteran with the patience of a kindergarten teacher addressing particularly slow students. "In fact, our after-action reports tend to be somewhat understated. We have regulations against embellishment in official documentation." This statement was met with the kind of silence typically reserved for the moments when entire worldviews collapse like poorly constructed sandcastles in a tsunami. The Aquarian leader's tentacles writhed in what passed for nervous fidgeting among his species. "Our xenobiological assessment teams have requested permission to study human physiology more comprehensively. They are particularly interested in understanding how your species maintains combat effectiveness while sustaining injuries that would incapacitate, well, any other known form of life." "It's called stubbornness," the veteran replied. "Also proper training, adequate nutrition, and what our drill instructors call refusing to die out of spite. These are not advanced concepts." The tribunal chamber's AI, apparently deciding that now was an appropriate time to add insult to injury, chose this moment to present the statistical analysis that everyone had been avoiding. Holographic displays filled the air with numbers that painted a picture of military incompetence so comprehensive it approached art. "Casualty ratios," announced the AI with the cheerful efficiency of a machine that didn't understand embarrassment, indicate that human forces achieved tactical superiority, despite technological disadvantages approximating several centuries of development. Projected invasion timeline of 72 hours was exceeded by a factor of, well, the invasion was repelled, so technically the timeline extends to infinity. Admiral Vex Prime's ethereal form flickered with what could charitably be called acceptance of cosmic justice. The consortium wishes to formally acknowledge that human military capability were accurately represented in all previous testimony. We also wish to express our appreciation for the restraint shown by human forces during the recent unpleasantness. This was another masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. Recent unpleasantness was how the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were now referring to what military historians would later catalog as the most one-sided conflict since the invention of war. Human forces hadn't just repelled the invasion. They had done so while simultaneously conducting what appeared to be an impromptu educational seminar on the practical applications of kinetic warfare. The veteran stood, her movements carrying the casual precision of someone who had spent her career being right about things that mattered. The Terran Defense Force is prepared to provide updated tactical assessments and training materials to any member species interested in understanding human military doctrine. We've also prepared a comprehensive guide titled Why Humans Don't Exaggerate Military Reports, a practical introduction to species-specific combat psychology. She paused, allowing the full weight of irony to settle over the chamber like a particularly dense fog. The guide is approximately 1,200 pages long. Chapter 1 is titled, They Really Can Shoot That Far. Chapter 2 covers Yes, They Actually Carry That Much Equipment. Chapter 12 addresses Field Surgery is Not a Metaphor. The tribunal chamber buzzed with the sounds of various species attempting to process the realization that humanity's greatest military secret was apparently complete and total honesty about their capability. As the veteran walked toward the chamber's exit, her stride carried the satisfied confidence of someone who had watched the universe's most advanced civilizations collectively fail a basic intelligence test. At the doorway she paused and turned back to address the assembled delegates one final time. Oh, and gentlemen, that veteran you dismissed as a liar, she was actually being modest. Our really impressive soldiers don't usually survive long enough to testify at tribunal. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire galaxy reconsidering everything it thought it knew about the small blue-green planet that had just taught them the most expensive lesson in military history. And somewhere in the depths of space, the remnants of the most technologically advanced invasion fleet ever assembled continued their long journey home, carrying with them the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that happen to be true.